Welcome to our first webinar in our Sterility Assurance Trilogy this spring, Cracking the Sterilization Packaging Code. My name is Leanne Kiefer, and I have the pleasure of being the Director of Clinical Services and Education with the Hufridi Group. Paper, plastic, and a little bit of adhesive. How difficult can that be for us to manage? But we know that the mechanics of the sterilization units have become much more sophisticated with the technology. And likewise, the sterilization packaging options that we have available to us have become more complex with a wider range of choices in materials, design, and features. And so when we talk about cracking the code of sterilization packaging, it actually begins with understanding the method of sterilization that we're using. And in dentistry, we tend to use saturated steam primarily. However, we have to make sure that if in our practices we are using dry heat or unsaturated chemical vapor, that we're also choosing sterilization packaging that's compatible with that method of sterilization. We also have to look at the type and the design of the material that we're using, the specific design and type of the instruments that we're going to be sterilizing, and then select the best material and or wrap that's going to be able to secure the contents during sterilization, and then also maintain sterility during delivery and storage for use with patients. So our overall goals, these are nothing new. We've seen them before. We want to have an orderly process of processing of our instruments, that we're following, basically the 6 steps of instrument reprocessing. Our goal is that we are going to protect our patients from cross-contamination post-sterilization with our instruments. We also have minimized exposure risk to staff, and because we've invested so much money in our instruments, by using the appropriate sterilization and packaging methods, we're going to preserve the value of those items long-term. We need to talk a little bit about some alphabet soup, so to speak, because the sterilization packaging is regulated by the Food and Drug Administration. It is considered, in fact, to be a medical device. It's classed as at a level 2. And the basic premise is, the purpose is it's going to be used to house or enclose another medical device, meaning our instruments. The materials have to allow for the penetration of the sterilant, whatever that may be, whether it's steam or it's dry heat or it's a vapor. The sterilant has to be able to penetrate through the materials to be able to access the enclosed instruments. And then that same material has to be able to close at the end of the cycle so that it's going to maintain the sterility of the instruments until we're ready to use them. When we talk about FDA, there's a couple little terms that I really want to make sure that we're all on the same page with. Again, what FDA does is they regulate good manufacturing practices and the labeling of that device. And the labeling of the device is going to be important with how the instructions for use, or IFU, are written. When FDA goes through this process, please, we want to make sure that we never use the word approved. FDA does not approve. What they do is they clear an item for use based on the validation testing and the claims that have been made against that product. When people are using an FDA cleared device, it's important that we follow the IFUs, because if we don't, that is considered to be off-label use, and that may result in less effective performance of an item if it's not used according to its cleared validation. So what are the details that we need as users? What do we need to have available within our sterility assurance program and documentation? We need to have the detailed IFUs, instructions for use, that include the reprocessing instructions for each and every item, each and every instrument that we have within our portfolio of instruments. So you can't just say, because I'm using this brand of instruments, I only need to have one. It is going to be different if you have a forceps or you have a scaler. So you have to have those detailed IFUs available. Likewise, you have to have the detailed IFUs for any of the sterilization packaging because it has been validated for use, and you have to make sure that you're following each of those steps. Some information that may not come automatically with product are technical bulletins or technical data, but you can get that information from the manufacturers of sterilization packaging. And what that will do is it will tell you what some of the product validation was, what were the testing protocols that that particular product went through that allowed it to have the intended use with sterilization. There may be product evaluations that you can request, or the other thing to think about is when we're doing our annual review of products, having a form that we're evaluating the products we're currently using to make sure that it is in fact the best product that we have available to us at the moment. It is important to have your customer service and your support team information available if something comes up. If you have a response that it doesn't, your chemical indicator isn't reacting like you thought that it should. Have those numbers locally available instead of having to go sort through to find them. Some manufacturers will actually offer in-service and training when you're switching to a new product to make sure that you fully understand the features and benefits of how that product is to be used. Or they may have something available online that as a team you can watch to make sure that everybody's on the same page for best use of that particular product. Key information point. It's important that you're aware of shelf life documentation, and we're going to go into this in detail toward the end of the presentation. But sterilization materials will have expiration dates based on date of manufacture. They will also have shelf life documentation. Certain ones will that says after you've sterilized the product based on our testing, this is how long it can be stored on a shelf before it needs to be reprocessed. So just keep that term shelf life sort of in your mind at the moment. When you're selecting sterilization products, packaging products, there are a list of criteria that you want to say, how does this meet up? How does it compare? First of all, the simple thing is you want to make sure that it is in fact has been cleared by the FDA for use. You know, I had somebody call me that was doing dry heat sterilization, and they were concerned because their packaging was catching fire. And what I ended up finding out is that they were using brown paper lunch bags in a dry heat sterilizer. Obviously not an FDA approved, or excuse me, FDA cleared device. You also have to make sure that the material is compatible with the type of sterilization method that you're using. And this is really important if you're using something like the plastic pouches that often are coming on a roll. Many of those are not always cleared for steam sterilization. So you want to make sure that you're reading the detailed information if you are in fact buying a new product, that it is going to be compatible with your method. It has to be suitable for the type of items that are being sterilized. As I said before, you need to make sure that you have your manufacturer's instructions for use available. We have to make sure that it's going to allow penetration of the sterilant. Here's a thought. In dentistry, we tend to use sterilization wrap, the blue wrap, and or plastic paper peel pouches most often. When you're thinking about peel pouches, the only side that the steam sterilization can enter on a peel pouch is the paper side. The laminate or the plastic is impervious, and steam is not going to enter there. You want to make sure that the quality of the materials that you're selecting are in fact going to be able to provide an adequate barrier or protection against tearing or puncture. You also have to look at if there's an adhesive tab, say to seal the sterilization pouch, or you're looking at steam sterilization adhesive tape. You want to make sure that it's going to be able to permit secure and complete closure. How wide is that adhesive seal on your sterilization pouch? Another thing they talk about is seal integrity and tamper evident. If somebody, mistakenly opens a pouch or a pack and said, oh, that's not what I needed, we have to be able to see that it's evident that the seal has been tampered with, and once it's open, it needs to be reprocessed, even if those instruments have not been used, because when you open it, it is no longer sterile. You want to protect the contents from any type of physical damage. You also, ease of use. You want to be sure it's easy enough for you to be able to open. Oftentimes you're going to be having obviously gloved hands, and so you want to make sure you're going to have an ease of an aseptic presentation. Free of any type of toxic ingredients, because we don't want that to be able to be exposed to the instruments that it's containing. If I could highlight or put a star on the last one bullet point, I would. Be non-linting. You don't think about this very often, but I've talked to our sterilizer technician friends, and one of the things that they're seeing with repairs or maintenance issues is filters and valves are getting clogged with lint. And so you want to make sure that the materials that you're putting in there every day is not going to cause any additional lint going into through the sterilization process. Also, please, please do not put any type of over-the-counter paper towel on the bottom of the tray of your sterilizer to try and help with any type of water condensation. Those paper towels are not approved to be used inside a sterilization device and definitely will cause linting issues. So when we talk about types of packaging, there's basically three types. There's pouches, there's textiles, and there's nonwovens. And in dentistry, as I said earlier, we tend to use pouches and the wraps or nonwovens most frequently. If you're talking about types of wraps, for some reason, if you're in an oral surgery office, sometimes they are using the textiles or the woven fabrics, and these are usually either 100% cotton or a synthetic blend. These items are going to be reusable, but these things do require laundering. It's not like you can just keep using them over and over again. You need to follow the IFU from that textile manufacturer. They have to be delinted and they have to be inspected for holes and any type of degradation of the fabric. And recommendation is to use a light table if in fact you are using a reusable textile. So inspection and mending of holes and defects are important. Also a bit time consuming, which is why we tend to prefer the disposable options of single-use pouches and single-use non-woven wraps. Sometimes you'll see the acronym SMS, and that just simply means it's the type of synthetic material. It's a spun bond, melt blown, spun bond synthetic material. And essentially it's fibers that are softened by heat, and then they're hardened by cooling, and then they're pressed to form sheets, and that creates the drapable fabrics that we're used to using. Some things you should know when you're selecting, in particular, pouches at this point. Pouches are basically made up of paper, laminate, and adhesive. And so just looking at a pouch, you don't know about the quality of the materials. So some of the questions you might want to ask is what type of paper is used to create that pouch? You're looking for the words somehow like medical grade or surgical grade and craft paper, craft with a K. The thing about this type of material is that it is a pure cellulose material. There are no other byproducts that are put into that paper as filler, so that it's going to be consistent across the entire grain of the paper, which is going to then allow the penetration of the steam very evenly. And then because the porosity or the holes in the paper that the steam gets through, they're about 0.1 microns in size. So they're going to open up during the steam presence cycle, and then when the dry cycle begins, those same fibers are now going to close those pores so that it creates that barrier to maintain sterility. The craft paper also doesn't have any type of chemicals that are going to brighten it and make it look whiter, because you don't want to have any type of toxic chemicals that might be released during the sterilization process. This particular type of fiber also withstands a lot of pressure, because think about the PSI, somewhere between 18 and 27, give or take, PSI. That's going to put a lot of pressure on that paper to hold steady during the sterilization process. And so it's going to reduce puncture or breaking of those strands during the process. So you want to have something that's about a 40 to 60 pound weight paper. And the investment that you make in purchasing is going to show the direct quality of the materials that are being used. So ask about the paper, ask about the weight. The laminate, you should be having a minimum of a 2 millimeter thick laminate that's going to be adhered to the paper for the quality. You know, again, while that laminate doesn't allow for penetration of the sterilant, it's going to be key during storage that you don't want it to get dry and become brittle and crack. So just a couple things to look at. I'm just going to go through not all 10 of the features, but things that when you're looking at the pouch, you know, don't just say, yes, it's got a flap and it's sealed on 3 sides. You want to look at the width of the adhesive. The wider the width, the more effective your tamper-resistant seal is going to be, because that adhesive strip has to actually be seated specifically 50% on the laminate and 50% on the paper, because that's what's going to create that complete seal. So the wider the laminate, the better the seal. It's also helpful to look for a perforation where that tab is joined to the paper, because that perforation is going to help to guide that tab so that it seats appropriately at the best spot. You also want to look at the side rails of the pouches. You want to see what the width of that adhesive strip are. Some pouches that you look at, you may actually see that there are multiple heat seals. And the reason you may have and you'd want multiple heat seals, think about that pouch under pressure of steam. It's going to be expanded, you know, like a popcorn bag in a microwave oven. And that's a lot of pressure on those side seals. If the internal seal pops because of the pressure, but you have additional seals toward the outside, it's going to be able to maintain the integrity of that pouch. So either look for multiple seals, heat seals, or look for a really wide strip. You also want to look at the bottom where you're going to be opening the pouch. It helps if the bottom is not flat across. It helps if there's actually a chevron or somewhat of a dart, a little arrow-like configuration at the bottom, because that's going to have a little bit of grace or a little bit of give. When that pouch expands, that chevron gives it some flexibility. It also prevents instruments from poking through. It gives it a little bit more of a better positioning of the instruments once they're in the pouch. Remember, I talked about ease of opening. Some of them will have thumb notches like you see at the number of 10, because if you're trying to open this for an aseptic presentation in front of your patient, the last thing that you did when you were seated was you put your gloves on, and now you want to be able to separate that laminate from the paper. And so having a thumb notch is very, very helpful. We also know that many of our pouches that are available today have built-in chemical indicators, because this is one of the guidelines from CDC. We must have a chemical indicator inside each pouch or package. And if that chemical indicator is not visible on the internal, in this case it is, then an external indicator is also required. Now, some of you may see pouches like the one here, is that there's a chemical indicator on this side and there's a chemical indicator on that side, and they're 2 different colors. Reason being, it's 2 different sterilization methods that have been validated for this particular pouch. You're going to have, it would probably say steam on one side, and when it says it should turn dark brown or it should turn black, it's not a variation of that. It's not kind of brown and it's not kind of black. So you want to make sure that the intensity and hue of that chemical indicator has changed across the indicators fully. It doesn't look mottled. If you are doing steam sterilization, only the one side is going to turn. The other side, those other chemical indicators are going to stay whatever color they are unless they were exposed to that actual process. The other thing to ask when you're investing in sterilization pouches is what level of chemical indicator. And we're going to go into that in detail in our next webinar of this sterility assurance series, but it's something that you need to know. Most pouches are going to be a type 1 chemical indicator, which is only going to register one of the critical parameters of sterilization, which would be, in this case, time, temperature, and pressure in the form of steam. Some pouches are a multi-parameter, which means they're going to react to 2 or more of the sterilization parameters, so you're going to have a more sophisticated evaluation of the sterilization process. We need to think about size because it is recommended in our practices that we have multi-size pouches available depending upon the type of instrumentation sets that we're going to be using with our pouches. You want to make sure that you're preventing overloading, because if you put too many instruments in, like the picture you see on the left, what's going to happen when that pouch expands, obviously the length is going to shorten a little bit, and so the likelihood that you're going to have instruments poking through the paper side and compromising the integrity of that paper, you can't use that pouch. If you overfill it, you're going to breach the pouch. It also, when you're using the right size pouch, it allows the penetration of the sterilant. If you have a too small a pouch, you may not be able to get enough of the steam inside the pouch to be able to access all of the instruments. So choosing the right size pouch is very, very important. Likewise, if you overfill the pouch or you're using a pouch that's too small, you may have trouble with air removal out of the pouch at the end of the cycle. And then you're going to end up with wet packs. So there's a number of things to be looking at when you, not only when you put the instruments into the sterilizer, but also when you take them out and looking at the results. Now, you're also seeing on the right-hand side of the screen an example of an appropriately loaded pouch. When you put instruments in, before you seal it, you should be able to put that pouch flat on the counter, and the instruments should line up side by side like soldiers in one single row. They shouldn't be stacked up on top of each other. So if they're side by side, and you should have at least a 1/4 inch or a finger's width of clearance on either side of the outermost instruments, and you should have about an inch clearance from the top or headspace, again, to allow for appropriate filling of the pouch with steam and for effective drying as well. This is something that sometimes we just don't think about because we get so used to doing things one way, and there might be a better way or a best practice instead of a common practice. It's suggested that any instruments that have a handle or a grasp, so forceps, hemostats, scissors, an elevator, we should always position those in the pouch so that the working end is faced toward where we're going to open the thumb notch opening, because that's going to allow us to aseptically present, and it's going to give the clinician the most surface area to be able to grab the instrument to remove it from the pouch or package. So again, handles and hinged instruments should be opened and put toward the thumb notch or opening. This is talking about that perforation that we addressed earlier on, and you can see sometimes, you know, we all get in a hurry, and we are wearing our heavy-duty chemical puncture resistant utility gloves when we're doing packaging of instruments. And so sometimes it's a little bit unwieldy, and we need to make sure that we are following the instructions for how those pouches are to be sealed, because again, it has to do with the integrity of the seal and ability to maintain that sterility long term. So what I suggest to people is, before you put the first instrument in that pouch, sort of fold the flap over and then run your index finger and thumb along that perforation. It creates a memory seal so that once you have the instruments in and that pouch is now bulked up a little bit, that flap almost knows exactly where it's supposed to be placed for complete closure. Thanks to Noelle Kelch for these photographs, because what you're seeing on the top left is obviously overclosure. And I can tell you that this pouch, where that opening is at the top of the laminate, is not sealed because of the way that tape is positioned. And so the contents are not maintaining sterility. When you see the second picture and you see that it's sort of at an angle, it's oversealed, and you're seeing any types of little gaps or wrinkles, that's called tunneling. Steam can get in there, and so not only can steam get in, so can microorganisms. You need to have it sealed. So that would be considered an incomplete seal. And then again, the last one, it's somebody used too big of a pouch and they were trying to save room, and so they folded it down over, and it's folded 100% on the laminate. So you do not have a seal on that pouch. Basically, these are not approved for use with a medical device. Okay, so we cannot use any type of elastic band, whether it's an instrument, whether it's been made by a dental company like you see on the right. We can't put our instruments together in a bundle and put them in the steam sterilizer, or in the ultrasonic for that matter, because the steam or the ultrasonic cavitation isn't going to be able to get to the middle. So you can't band your instruments together. That is not an approved use. That's one of those off-label uses by the FDA. Steam sterilization pouches are single use only. Don't get creative and think, I'm not going to use the adhesive seal, I'm just going to take this paper clip and close it. If you don't have a seal for integrity, it doesn't maintain the sterility. Some of you who are involved in community health centers, and you may be following a protocol along with your medical side that advocates for double peel pouching, which essentially means a pouch within a pouch. First of all, you need to make sure that the pouches that you're using, the particular brand that you're using, has been validated to be double pouched. Not all pouches are. You also have to make sure that the instruments, if you're going to be using double pouching, have been validated for that process. So it's checking with both manufacturers. If you are using double pouching, you're going to use two different size pouches. They need to be sequential sizing. Obviously, the outer pouch is larger because there has to be a 1/4 inch clearance on all sides of the smaller pouch. The two sides, top and bottom, has to be a 1/4 inch clearance. You can't sort of fold, bend, finagle that smaller pouch inside the larger one. It has to be appropriately sized. It also cannot be oversized. You can't use a 3.5 by 11, a 3.5 by 9 pouch and put it inside a 10 by 14, because there's going to be problems with penetration of the sterilant and also getting out the steam at the end of the cycle. So they need to be sequentially sized. Both pouches need to be sealed. The inner pouch must be sealed first, and you want to make sure that you've taken your hand to push out any of the excess air before you seal it and put it inside the outer pouch, because again, it could impact the sterilization process. You want to make sure in double pouching that you're doing paper to paper and plastic to plastic, so that you should be able to see the contents through the double pouching. You would not put it so that you see paper on both sides. So paper to paper, plastic to plastic. We're going to move out of pouches and into sterilization wrap, and we are seeing an increased use of instrument management type systems, cassettes, and the use of sterilization wrap. It is possible, you may choose to put cassettes inside pouches. You need to make sure that that particular cassette has been approved for use inside a sterilization pouch. And again, size is going to be very, very important. You can't have a pouch that's just big enough for you to be able to sort of finagle that cassette in, because remember, it's going to expand, that pouch is going to need to expand during the process. And you could compromise, you could tear, poke, breach the integrity. So looking at the size of your cassettes is going to be very important. So when you are selecting sterilization wrap, we again need to make sure that it's compatible with the sterilization method that we're using, that it's compatible with our instruments and the type of containment system or cassette that is going to be wrapped inside. It's important that you know size and weight contents, both of the cassettes that you're using when they're filled, because there's going to be a different weight or heft to them once they have instruments inside. And the wraps are going to be validated for how much weight they have been tested for. 13 pounds is common, but if that's something that you've not looked at with the wrap you're using, you would want to know what is the weight limit for use with this wrap. User preference comes into use of wrap because we have some different choices of single and double layer wrap. We have choices as to the methods that we use to wrap, and we're going to go through those. You want to make sure that you have adequate amount of storage when you're using an instrument management system. And we're going to talk about common practice and best practice with storage of instruments, both with pouches as well as wrapped cassettes. And we need to remember, no matter how wonderful you are at wrapping gifts for the holidays or birthdays, wrapping a medical device, an instrument cassette, is very different. And so we need to modify some of the tribal learning that we've done with how we place that wrap, how we drape it over the cassette, because having an aseptic presentation, being able to remove that wrap as efficiently as we wrapped it is going to be very important. And obviously, we always look at cost to see what the use of the particular product is. Now, with sterilization wrap, this is sometimes an aha when I do lectures. Sterilization wrap has been validated using a 2-layer wrap. This is what has validated when they often will say a sterilization wrap has a 99.7% efficacy as far as filtration. That's with a 2-layer wrap. So if you choose to do a 1-layer wrap when your product has been validated and cleared by the FDA as a 2-layer wrap, that is considered off-label. And so you need to know how your product was validated. When you are doing 2 layers of wrap, you have choices of, you can do it sequentially, which means sort of, you can think of it as a package in a package. You're going to wrap the cassette completely the first time, then you're going to lay that wrapped cassette down on a new piece of wrap, and you're going to wrap it again, a package within a package. The other choice that we have, some manufacturers offer a bonded wrap, which means that it's 2 pieces of wrap, but they're ultrasonically welded or bonded on either 2 or 4 of the edges. So when you pick up that wrap, you're already picking up 2 at the same time. With that, obviously, you're going to be doing simultaneous wrapping because it's bonded together, and you're going to only do 1 wrap procedure. So obviously you save time when you're working with a bonded wrap and simultaneous. I will mention that if you are buying single layer wrap, the recommendation, best practice recommendation, excuse me, from AAMI Standard 79 is if you are not using a bonded wrap, sequential wrapping is recommended. So don't try to just put those 2 pieces one on top of the other and do a simultaneous wrap. Best practice, sequential wrap for using 2 separate single layers. You have choices as far as the design of the wrap that you use. In dentistry, most commonly, we are seeing the envelope method used, and that's the diagram that you see there. Envelope or diagonal method, sometimes it's called. That has to do with your positioning the cassette at the center of almost the diamond shape, and then you're going to first of all bring down that top fold of the diamond across the top of the cassette, and then you would bring up the 2 sides, and then finally the bottom gets folded in and tucked with a tab. This envelope method is the recommended method for small to medium-sized cassettes. If you are working with a large cassette, a surgical cassette, some restorative cassettes, an implant cassette, a periosurgery cassette, a square wrap method, sometimes people call it a parcel method, is recommended with larger cassettes. It is going to be important that a chemical indicator is put inside the cassette with the instruments before it's wrapped. And because that wrapping is opaque, you can't see the chemical indicator, you need to also have a chemical indicator on the outside of the wrap, CDC guideline. The next slide I'm going to move to. This is just some of my helpful hints, is what I like to call them. When you are wrapping, this is showing you a square or a parcel wrap on the left-hand side. And what you want to see is that top piece that's in the clinician's right hand. That actually has to cover the entire top of that cassette and actually come over a little bit from where the hinge is before you would start bringing in the sides. This is where I'm saying it's not like a gift that you're wrapping. You want to cover that top completely, then bring in the two sides and bring up the bottom. The picture on the right, we tend to be somewhat frugal in dentistry. And this is not necessarily about being as neat as you would want to be with wrapping a gift. You want to use an adequate amount of tape, because think about what that tape is going through during the sterilization cycle. It's being put under about 270 degrees of heat, under steam and under pressure, and that adhesive has to hold on to that synthetic material. And if you're not using enough tape, you're going to have it pop. The picture on the right shows you about 3 different good practices that I'd like you to consider or remember. First of all, when you come around the edge, do not place the tape horizontally. Actually bring it from the top over to the side, as you see on the left and right sides where the tape is positioned. You want to use about 3 to 4 inches of tape. Now, if you've got a teeny tiny cassette, that might be overkill, but you never want to use like an inch or just a 2-inch piece of tape. It's got to be able to wrap around the edge. You also see that they left a tab that's going to help for opening aseptically that pack. So once the tape comes off, they can pull that tab and it will allow the draping or the opening of that fabric to fall away from the cassette so that you have aseptic presentation. With larger cassettes, and I will tell you in medicine, this is considered best practice. You see that piece that goes around the middle, I call it a belly band, because it's going all the way around from the left side across the entire width of the cassette and then coming down to the other side. That would be considered a best practice, not just putting the tapes where you finish the last part of the wrap, but putting it across the center as well. Also, you see that they wrote on the tape, never ever write on the cassette, on the sterilization wrap fabric itself. It's not validated to be written on. You would never write on the paper of a pouch, because remember, those pores open and close, and if you've got ink on there, it can compromise that integrity. So you only write on the laminate of the pouch, and you only write on the tape of a wrapped cassette. And also, we have to use validated steam sterilization tape. Just because masking tape looks like sterilization tape, it's not been validated for use. Obviously considered off-label use. When we talk about those chemical indicators, and again, there's a full webinar coming up on that in April, remember that these are simply sensitive inks or chemicals that are going to react to, depending upon what classification of indicator it is, it's going to react to one or more of the sterilization parameters. However, chemical indicators, whether they are built in, like you see here, or they're going to be a type 5, an integrating indicator, like you see here, or it's something as simple as a type 1 sterilization tape that's just simply an exposure process indicator. None of these chemical indicators guarantee sterilization has been achieved. None of these have live organisms on them. There's no spores on them, so you can't prove lethality. all it says is essentially the contents of that package were exposed to whatever parameters that particular chemical indicator was measuring. So you want to make sure that we're not giving credit to those indicators beyond what they are actually validated to do. Again, medical device, class 2, FDA. Labeling. We talked a little bit about where do you label. Let's talk about the how. It's important that we are using the appropriate type of labeling device that is compatible, it's a word we've been using a lot, compatible with medical grade materials. If you are using a wet pen, it's commonly known as a marker, there are Sharpie markers that are considered industrial markers that have been validated against the ASTM standard that you see listed, the D4236. And it's evaluating the criteria that you see on the right side of your screen. And the way you know if the Sharpie marker in your practice meets those standards, it will have this AP symbol. It will either be in a circle or it might be in what looks like a laurel wreath. If you don't see it, it means that that particular product hadn't been subjected to that voluntary testing of ASTM. If you want to use the label system, and we're starting to see more and more dental practices are going to an automated label system, make sure that you're not taking a do-it-yourself type of label device and creating your own labels. You have to use an approved medical device with approved labels that have the right type of adhesive to be used on our medical products, medical dental products. Every one of these things is considered an off-label use. You cannot go to your favorite office supply store and buy an ink pad and a stamp and put dates on your packaging. First of all, you can't put date stamp on the paper because we can't have it on the ink of the pouch. You can't put it on the paper of the wrap. The ink has not been validated for use. You cannot order a custom stamp from a stationery store that has whatever it is you want to have that you can write and fill in. That can't be used. You cannot use a self-adhesive label that you print off of your printer and put them onto your packages. You have to use an approved wet pen with medical device. Cannot use a pencil because it's not permanent. It's not indelible. You cannot use a wax crayon. You cannot use a ballpoint pen. You cannot use a regular marker. All of these are off-label use. Okay, so now we've gotten through our cleaning, our packaging, the sterilization process. Now we need to think about storing our sterile materials appropriately so that they can maintain sterility until we're ready to use them with patients. This guideline of the environment is from the AAMI Standard 79. This is not from our CDC guidelines at this point. I'm sharing this with you because the reality is these type of requirements are coming in dentistry. We're already seeing it in Canada. And so I'm just sort of giving you a heads up of some things that you may want to take a look at in your own sterilization center to say, or wherever you're storing instruments, are we meeting these specific criteria? It's got to be 8 to 10 inches off the floor. Should there ever be a flood, you want to make sure that your packages are not exposed. It has to be about at least 9 inches from the ceiling. There has to be a 2-inch space from the outside walls of the building. We have to be able to maintain basically room temperature, 64 to 72 degrees. So 72 is max. Maximum of 70% humidity. A lot of that has to do, that temperature and humidity is because of the impact that it will have over time on your sterilized, the materials of your sterilized products, because temperature and humidity can impact those materials. You want to make sure that it's a clean and dry environment and that you have it in a controlled and secure space. You'll also notice that the packaging area on this particular sterilization center, there is a demarcation. There's actually a physical wall that happens between the cleaning and prep area into the clean, dry, controlled space for wrapping. And you should have a demarcation between your cleaning prep area and your wrap area, even if it's something as simple as a piece of tape that you put down on the countertop to demarcate. And that is a CDC guideline. Storage and delivery. When instruments come out of your sterilizer, before you're going to move them or transport to where they're going to be stored, they should be completely cool before you move them. You should not be putting warm instruments into a transport container to move them, because while the pack is still warm, the fibers of the material are more vulnerable and you could get tearing, ripping, puncturing. And so you want to make sure that it's totally cool, that there's no moisture, and you want to make sure that you're not doing things like dragging them across the countertop. You're not putting them, stacking them up on top of each other like a deck of cards and then carrying a stack of cassettes into another area. They shouldn't be stacked like that. You also want to have a written in your infection control manual, what is your stock rotation protocol? How do you make sure that the package that you sterilized on February the 14th is going to be used before the same type content package that you sterilized on March 1st? So the first in, first out. How do you handle that, and how the instruments are put away, and how are people made aware of your stock rotation policy? We want to limit the number of times we handle a sterile package. The more time you touch it, the more likelihood is that you're going to compromise the integrity of the materials. I've heard it said anecdotally, you want to limit it to about 3 to 4 times, meaning you touch it to take it out of the sterilizer is 1. You wait for it to, to cool down, and you pick it up again to transport it to the area of storage is 2. When you take it out of storage to deliver it to the patient is 3. This means you don't want to put your pouches inside a like a Sterilite tub and you go rummaging through to find the one that you want. That's not appropriate stock rotation, and it's not limiting touching and handling. So that's not a best practice. And it is the onus of the clinician who takes the packages out of the sterilizer to inspect them to make sure the integrity of the materials is what it should be and that the chemical indicators have turned. It is also then the responsibility of the clinician who is the end user, the terminal user of that set, to again look at the materials to make sure they've not been compromised during storage. If there is any type of breach, they need to be unpackaged, reprocessed, and repackaged, and then sterilized again. We cannot use any compromised packaging. If an instrument, a sharp instrument has poked through, we cannot use because it compromises the integrity. So use your eagle eye at this point. These are just some pictures that I wanted to show you of what I call common practice. We like to use drawers in dentistry. I think it's because it's an ease of use. What you're seeing on the left-hand side would not be considered best practice, because you're going to have a real hard time. How are you controlling the touching if you're trying to find the right forceps that you want? So this method of storage would not be best practice, and you're increasing the risk of compromising the integrity of the pouch or package. And while we look at the one on the right-hand side with the cassettes, and it looks lovely, I mean, it's very organized and it's sized, graded, we should not be stacking those cassettes on top of each other. Remember the slide before when we talked about compressing? If you're putting them on top of each other, the cassette on the very bottom is bearing the total weight of all of those other instrument packs. And remember when we talked about maximum weight that particular wrap is rated to? So what we need to do is, just like in your sterilizer, flip them up on edge like books on a shelf, so that when you need to slide it out, you're just sliding between the two. You're not pulling it out from underneath the weight of the other cassettes. One of the things that I like on this is you see that piece of tape, sterilization tape, on the end where it's going to be visible. That may have a note as far as what the contents of that package are. It can also have the date of sterilization on those package, and you can see by the tape there is an external indicator that shows the exposure indicator that in fact it was processed. So, put them up on end, and pouches and cassettes should be stored behind closed doors. They should not be put on an instrument tray and then put onto a rack and somehow put that magic patient bib over the top of it. That's not going to protect it. It has to be behind closed doors. All right, not an attractive picture, but do not recycle or repurpose boxes that come to your practice to store materials, patient care materials in, because in particular, corrugated cardboard can be contaminated with a number of things. Obviously, dust, dirt, you don't know what the conditions of how that particular box was stored before, other things were put inside to be shipped. We also know that certain type of larvae can populate themselves and breed inside there. And I will also mention that cockroaches have a predilection for corrugated cardboard. So do not put or transport any type of sterile or patient care item in shipping containers of any sort. Another issue that comes up often is wet packs and wicking. When you are choosing the right size pouch or the right size wrap and use for your cassette, and you're putting in the correct amount of instruments, and you are loading that sterilizer with best practices of vertical loading and use of racks on the shelves, this is going to allow for the 360-degree circulation of the sterilant, and it also then allows for 360 circulation of the dry air to dry it. If you put instrument cassettes one on top of each other, you're not going to be able to get 360-degree penetration or circulation of the sterilant. And so this is one of the main reasons. Overloading or misloading of the sterilizer is the #1 reason for wet packs. And wet packs are in fact a concern, because if the fabric, whether it's the crepe of the wrap or it's the paper of the pouch, if it is still damp, if it is not bone dry, it means those pores are still open. And you have a chance of wicking bacteria from either your hand, your glove, the countertop, whatever, into that package. So wet packs should never be touched. And you can't take them out and say, I'll just let them dry on the counter. That's what your dry cycle and your sterilizer is for. You cannot use fans on damp packs to dry them. That is off-label use of a medical device. And so visibly wet packs, whether it's a couple droplets or it's saturated with condensation, they are considered contaminated and need to either go through the dry cycle appropriately or be reprocessed and repackaged. And I've given you a list of some of the things that might be contributing to wet packs. And wet is wet. It doesn't matter how wet. If there's dampness, if it's not bone dry, that's not considered ready to be taken out and stored. So how long can we keep sterile packages stored? Years ago, it was a time-related event, and there are still some facilities that may have time-related rotation as their protocol. I'm giving you from AAMI Standard that they're saying as long as a package has not been compromised during storage, therefore the contents are remaining sterile. So event-related sterility, nothing happened to that pouch or pack. It wasn't dropped, it didn't get ripped, it didn't get some coffee splashed on it, it didn't get set in a puddle of water on the countertop. So contamination is event-related rather than time-related. And sometimes you'll see this abbreviated ERS, event-related sterility. Again, this should be designated in your infection control manual as to the protocol, because that's part of your stock rotation protocol. So what are some of those adverse things that can happen? I sort of gave you a list a moment ago. The package becomes wet or soiled, if it's damaged or dropped, if you have extreme temperature or humidity variances, if there are those of you that are part of a mobile clinic and you're putting the instruments into your car and taking it from one place to another. Cars get very hot very quickly in the summertime, and that could be a contraindication and impact that you went beyond the 70-degree temperature, or 70% humidity. So you need to think about those things when transporting. You also have to remember, if the shelf life from the manufacturer means that when a manufacturer produces sterilization materials, they'll have an expiration date. It's anywhere from 2 to 3 years from expiration date, depending upon the manufacturer. That means that if I have a box of pouches that says it expires on April the 15th, I can use a pouch on April the 14th, and if the sterilization process is effective, I then have a shelf life of another 2 to 3 years according to the manufacturer that I'm working with. But on April 16th, if I have pouches left in that box, I cannot use them because the pouch has expired at that point. So you have to remember, expiration date is different from shelf life date. Again, has to be part of your stock rotation process. Oh, one other thing before I leave this. When you get pouches, again, we like to be nice and tidy in dentistry. Do not take all the pouches or all the wrap out of and put it into some sort of a storage, because you'll have no idea of the lot number or expiration date unless you have a method to track. So you have to be very careful about taking product out of identification boxes for lot number and expiration dates. So this is your manufacturer's expiration date. I said date of manufacturer, 1 to 3 years. The reason is they have done validation testing on those materials. And that has nothing to do with the sterilization process. They're just saying that these materials are going to behave and be validated to these standards up to, whatever their time is. And they do both real-time testing and they do rapid aging testing. And so that's how they come up with that time frame. That is different from shelf life dating, which we just discussed. So this is part of your established policy that you need to have written in your infection control manual. How do you label? What do you label with? What has to happen for the reprocessing of your items based on the IFU of the instrument, the cassette, and the pouch, and the wrap, depending upon what you're using. What items and how do they need to be dated? What's your rotation policy? And how do you and who's responsible for monitoring the compliance with that policy? All right, we've made it through the webinar tonight, and this is just to give you a reminder or sort of a heads up. We finished the sterilization packaging webinar today. On April the 21st, we're going to have At the Speed of Chemical Indicators webinar. And the last one in the trilogy will be on May the 12th, and it's going to cover biological monitoring, and we're going to be focusing more on what are the challenges with biological monitoring, mail-in versus in-office, and how do you make your decision tree? How do you troubleshoot? So it's not the basic, what is biological monitoring, is what do we do if we have a problem? So that's going to be the approach. And I'd like to challenge you, we've covered a lot of information tonight, and I'd like to challenge you to think about, you can't do everything all at once. So, find out, are you meeting the basic requirements? And if not, what part of this information are you going to identify with and say, we have to do something differently on Monday? And instead of trying to change the whole thing, what one action can you change and track and monitor to improve, to get best practice with your sterilization? So that's my challenge to you. I'm now going to open up the Q&A, and it looks like we have quite a few questions to go through. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and just read some of these verbally, and then I'll answer them. Some individuals in offices open sterilization bags prior to the patient coming in and set them up on the instrument tray. Best practice would be to open, whether it's a pouch or a wrapped cassette, you want to open them after you've seated, you've got your PPE on appropriately, and you open those in front of the patient. That is considered best practice. So you were correct, Stephanie. All right. Is there no different grades of pouches based on the film? Many dental practices look at a pouch and get the cheapest pouch. You're going to pay more for thicker film and paper. Is that correct? Steve, you're exactly correct. Unfortunately, pouches are not graded like, we have our masks that if the manufacturer opts to go through ASTM testing, we can look at, a level 1, level 2, level 3 mask. We don't have that available. So I would encourage you, if you're looking to change pouches, ask for samples. Manufacturers are usually very happy to provide you with them. And sit down with all the samples side by side. Take them apart. Hold up that paper to the light and compare. You see one almost looks like onion skin and the other one you can't see through, it's so opaque. You can feel the difference in the weight of the paper. So you have to actually look and ask questions. Ask for those technical bulletins that I spoke of. And then, make sure that you do know the level of chemical indicator that is on a pouch, or what your indicators are rated as. So don't just take things at face value. Ask for documentation. Thank you, Steve. Okay. Was I going to address the issue about an all plastic pouch? And we often see those coming on a roll and you cut them to length. And this person is asking about a heat seal versus a self seal. We see less and less of the roll type pouches being used simply because there's more work to putting them together. You need to cut them to the right length. You have to find out if the IFU says, do they need to be double heat sealed, or do you have to sort of roll or fold them a number of times before you're going to apply sterilization tape to create the seal. This is one of the reasons that we tend to like the pouches with the self-adhesive. It's just much easier to use. And again, please be very careful if you are using the roll. Make sure that it is compatible. Some of like the Tyvek pouches, that's a particular type of plastic that's meant to be used with ethylene oxide or low temp sterilization. And if you put that material into a steam sterilizer, it's going to melt. So be very, very careful. Question about the chemical indicator, and I understand about AAMI standard 79. Dental practices are not, in a private practice, held to AAMI standard. If you are part of a community health center and you're being held to a JACO standard, you would have to comply with the AAMI standard 79. In dentistry, what CDC says in the 2003 guidelines is that you need to use a chemical indicator inside, and if it's not visible, you need to use another one outside. And they differentiate only between basically a type 1, which is an exposure or process indicator, and a multi-parameter, saying that it evaluates more at a higher level. But CDC does not state that we have to use a type 4 or a type 5. However, is that best practice? A multi-parameter inside a pouch is definitely going to be more definitive than a type 1 indicator inside a pouch. And I will agree that in Canada right now, they are required by province to use type 5 integrating indicators inside each pouch or pack. So that probably is in our future. There's a question about brand name, about are there pouches that are multi-parameter? And since we're not in the education portion, I can't address a brand name. I can tell you that there are, the SureCheck pouch is a validated multi-parameter, and that particular pouch requires time, temperature, and pressure in the form of steam in order for it to turn. So it exceeds what the ISO standards are for a type 2. There are other ones, and if you read your catalogs, if you ask your sales rep for the documentation on that product, you'll be able to see. In the US, they will not call them a type 4. They will refer to them as a multi-parameter. That same pouch will be referred to as a type 5 in Canada or Europe. That just happens to do with our FDA classification. The question about tip protectors. Tip protectors on sharp or curved instruments are available. You have to make sure they're validated for use with a device, with the instrument, as well as the type of the pouch or the pack. And you want to make sure if you have a curved instrument that the curved instrument is pointing down so that the convex side is to the outside of the pouch. Okay. At this point, I am at the end of my time, and I thank you. I'm there was a slide that showed my email if you have questions that you didn't get time to answer. Hufridi Group is committed to education beyond the moment. And so if something came up or you have a concern or you need additional information, we want to continue to support your needs. So you have my email and you have my phone number. And I want to thank you for attending tonight's webinar.